So now it is my pleasure, I think I'll close this. There we go. To welcome a truly esteemed panel of advocates and experts. I could spend a lot of time describing the many impressive accomplishments, but in the interest of getting to the meat of the conversation, I'm going to go the minimalist route. Our panel moderator tonight is Tiffany-Ann Taylor, Vice President of Transportation at the Regional Plan Association. And the panel includes Dr. Francis Lucerna, co-founder of El Puente and founding principal of the El Puente Academy for Peace. Michelle De La Uz, Executive Director of Fifth Avenue Committee. Mark Norman, Associate Dean of the Schack Institute of Real Estate at New York University. And Nilka Martel, Founder, Director of Loving the Bronx.
Okay, can you all hear me? Yes, excellent. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I love when the audience responds to me. Appreciate it. Thank you, fellow panelists. And thank you, Adam, for the documentary. One more round of applause for the documentary. So, after watching the documentary and learning more about the types of communities that have been harmed by the construction of the BQE, I appreciate the ethnic and gender diversity of tonight's panel for this discussion. In that same vein, people of color and immigrant communities have a long history with eco-friendly and sustainable ways of living. So, I'm going to start with Francis first. What are some of the ways that you remember from your childhood or young adult days that you now realize were environmentally friendly practices, and have any of those experiences shaped your work today?
Let me see. Oh, this is on. Great. Well, maybe I should start with a little bit of background, and that is that I was born and raised in Williamsburg, have lived there all of my life. My mother's family, which were Puerto Rican. My mother was second generation. My grandparents came from Puerto Rico in the early 1920s. Also lived in Williamsburg. So I am generationally a Williamsburg person. And I guess what I want to say is that growing up in Williamsburg, and it was described in the documentary, I grew up in an extremely diverse immigrant community. We had immigrant families from all over Europe. We had Italian, German, Irish. I had my best friend was Chinese, a Chinese immigrant, Black and Puerto Rican families. And I guess what I wanted to say to the question is really more about the experience of living in community. Living in a community where all of these families from all of these countries were really a community that shared culture, that shared values, and that shared practices. My father, who worked in Pfizer on the waterfront, which was then a vibrant manufacturing area, scraped up enough money to buy a small house in what is now the Hasidic community, which at that time was not. And there comes some of the practices. In all of those houses, there were these backyards, ours included. And they were the place where my father, who was an immigrant from the Philippines, who came during the war to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, really brought their cultural connection to the land. The Puerto Rican families, the Irish families, the Italian families, they all had these amazing gardens that were all connected. And we would, my father, and my neighbors, we had peach trees, fruit trees, we had vegetables that we'd share among the community in something like a food co-op, really. And the idea of gardening was so important to all of those families. And for us as kids who had to work the gardens, right? We really learned, and I think what was integrated within us was this connection that was part of our ancestry to the land. And I think that connection has stayed with me. And even through this whole now new iteration of what Williamsburg, what we call ground zero for what you do not want to have happen to a community in terms of gentrification and all of what Robert Moses and the BQE has brought. I think that idea of connection to the land still persists, and it persists with many of the families and the immigrant families in our community. And this connection of the sacredness of community as our land. And even if it's not a garden, maybe it's like my grandmother had, a Bustelo can filled with dirt on her fire escape where she grew herbs, healing herbs. And those recipes I still have, and many of our members at El Puente and in the community have. And those healing practices that come from our ancestry are those that we share together. So I'm going to leave it there and then pass it on.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Michelle.
I guess I'll pick up on the gardening theme. So I did not grow up in New York City. So I come from a working class immigrant family. I'm a product of bilingual education, and I grew up in New London, Connecticut, which is, when I grew up there, a third Latino, a third white, and a third African American. And where, I interestingly grew up immediately adjacent to I-95, literally immediately adjacent to it. And our neighbors were Italian. And we also had the gardens, both of us, and there was a lot of exchange of food going on. Despite the fact that my grandmother didn't speak any English, she got along great with the Italian family, and they sat on the porches together and, drank a lot of amaretto and things like that, and Kahlua. So the gardening piece really resonated for me, and it absolutely was a big part of my childhood and something that I try to continue with the herbs myself. I would say the other practice, I think there were two, actually, that I remember a lot. We turned off we got wet, got in the shower, turned it off, then did the cleaning, the shampooing and things like that, and then turn the shower back on to save water. And that was something that really, I think, both my mom, who grew up very poor, and my dad, who grew up in the Caribbean with, inconsistent water, I think, were practices that I was taught. And I remember, I think, getting to New York and then college too, and not having to think so much about turning off the water during the shower, and that was a good and a bad thing, obviously, reflecting back on that. The other, I would say, besides the gardening and the showering, was we hung our clothes out. We did not dry our clothes in a dryer. We hung our clothes out. That feeling, there's nothing like putting on a shirt that's been hung out to dry and it's stiff and it has the smell, from outside. It's a wonderful thing. So those are some of the memories that I have.
Thank you. Mark.
Well, I grew up on the other coast, but one of the things that resonates with me, and I think to answer your question, is that I grew up in a neighborhood that's from the 20s and 30s. And so while I grew up in a single-family house, a block away was a multifamily building. You could walk to businesses. We were able to walk to school. And so with things like these highways, some of them are starting to come down. Hopefully the BQE will as well. but I would also want to think about how we keep the variety of the neighborhoods before the BQE came through, because right now, the way we zone and the way we build doesn't provide some of that variety where people have the opportunity for a backyard or a mix of housing, which also creates a mix of neighbors, right? The garden apartment, the basement apartment, the multifamily, the single family. So I'm happy that I had that, and that's certainly what we have in our neighborhoods here. But I fear that when we tear these things down, we won't get some of that variety unless we're really deliberate about it.
Thank you, Nilka.
Good evening to you all. So I was born and raised in the Bronx. My parents are from Puerto Rico. And I think that the most impactful childhood memories that I have was every summer we would spend 2 weeks in Puerto Rico, and my grandmother, had this green space, and everything that we ate was something that she grew, and the eggs were from the chicken coop, and even the chickens that we ate were from the backyard. She had lush trees that we would water. There was a creek behind the house, so it was where my sisters and I would spend most of the days. And then coming back to the Bronx, it was the complete opposite, right? I lived in a building. It was a concrete jungle. We had the Bronx River near us, which we had no access to. We had Orchard Beach, which was the seasonal beach, another one of Robert Moses' creations. So I think the bulk of the work that I do, not just with Loving the Bronx, but through the Bronx River Alliance, has really been shaped by that. Whether it's we have the foodway at Concrete Plant Park, which is a foodway in a public park where there's only 2 in all of New York City, really advocating for waterfront access, particularly for people of color, and also, capping the Cross Bronx, right? Really looking to see where we can place more community gardens and green spaces and spaces for pedestrian plazas.
Thank you. If I can share, mine is the cookie butter tin, the butter cookie tin now being a sewing tin, if that's familiar to anyone. We all have that, right? It's a little bit of trauma related to it, I know. But the idea of sustainability, right, maybe not having that vocabulary, but you heard many shared experiences, especially with the direct connection to the land. So thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about green gentrification. That's why we're here. And I think actually, Mark, I might start with you to mix it up. So green gentrification refers to eco-friendly urban improvements that, while beneficial, inevitably increase property values and living costs, pushing out long-term residents. What are some examples of green gentrification that you've seen in your neighborhood and or work? In your opinion, is this a new phenomenon or is this just new vocabulary?
That's a great question. So I'm a Williamsburg resident. I moved there in '97, so I've seen some changes. And one of the things, I hope this answers the question, but one of the things that's interesting to me is we're in such a housing crisis that what I see going up along the BQE now, which is still just as polluted and just as noisy, are luxury apartments that are just as expensive as apartments not on the BQE. So I feel like we have to solve the housing crisis because the gentrification is going to happen without the neighborhoods necessarily getting better. So I think there has to be a mix, right? So I think we should never forego green infrastructure, but we really have to figure out how to really up the housing production in order to actually make neighborhoods better generally. So as examples, I think New York City is just expensive. It's expensive whether you're in a noisy place or and that's new. And so, some of the examples I have of sort of better outcomes is where you plan first, right? So when you're doing that infrastructure, what's happening to the land around it? Who owns it? Right? How is it programmed? Is there built-in affordability? At what percentage? So I think that's certainly what we're going to have to think through, as we think about the Cross Bronx, as we think about the BQE and other highways coming down.
Thank you. Francis, if I could turn to you next. So what examples of green gentrification are you seeing or familiar with in your work? And is this new vocabulary or something we're used to?
Gee, that's such a loaded question. I mean, when you talk about Williamsburg and what has happened. I think it's happening every single day. My late husband and I bought our house on Berry and South 4th Street, 3 blocks from what is now Domino Park, in 1982. And I won't even tell you what we paid for that house, nor will I tell you what the house is worth now, right? And we encouraged, because we were community folk and we were starting at Puente, we encouraged our neighbors to stay, right? And I think I want to say this right now. Every single day, I leave my house and I walk in the neighborhood, and there are places and spaces I don't even recognize. It is happening that quickly. And I think that, some of this conversation needs to be, really around rezoning, right? I mean, the waterfront and what the travesty of the waterfront with the 2005 rezoning that completely ignored a 197A process that went on in our community in Greenpoint with our community in terms of looking at what was possible out on the waterfront, only to have in 2005 the city decide, thank you very much, but we're moving in another direction, and here you have the waterfront, right? And what's happened there, and it continues. I think the other thing, and to something that Michael was talking about, I think, when you're talking about planning, and I think that's what this very, unbelievable documentary really shows us, is that, there needs to be a real seriousness and urgency around really the community planning process that in our 40+ years of activism in our community with many, many partners, we understand that's been going on, but there is no accountability. There is no accountability in terms of how and in which way those community plans and the input of community can really be actualized, realized, and funded. Community control in terms of development, I think, is also an issue. And I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but I think the fact remains we all understand what green gentrification is, and a place like Williamsburg and other places, what happens. But I think it's really in terms of what and how we can start to mitigate that.
Thank you. Michelle, do you want to take it next?
Well, just kind of, I think, building on what Francis just said, anything that's not intentional, that doesn't have equity at the center, and doesn't think about inclusion in an intentional way, can result in gentrification and displacement. Like, the market conditions themselves will result in gentrification and displacement. So you have to have strong forces, whether that's comprehensive planning, whether that's an organized community, where that's civically involved, neighbors, where that's, folks with relationships with the political decision makers, so that you can have a more inclusive vision of what society can be. When I think about green gentrification, or thinking about, let's just say economic development to the nth degree without necessarily thinking about some of the unintended consequences, parts of me start to think about the High Line and, what was it intended to be and what has it become and what might it become in the future. It's a beautiful place. And there wasn't necessarily a lot of folks living around it that got displaced, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been gentrification. So that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you. Nilka, please.
This is really on the forefront of, a lot of our minds in the Bronx as we, do this community engagement to cap the Cross Bronx, because we all realize that green spaces, right, will result in just an increase of property value. And, I don't know if there are any good answers, right? And I think that before we were talking, and I think that one of the things that really stood out for me was accountability, right? And how we can hold, whether that's the developer or the elected official, we've been restoring the Bronx River for 50 years. It was pretty much an open sewer. It is New York City's only freshwater river. Absolutely beautiful greenways and waterfront access parks. But when you look at the developments that are coming, and in particular, up in the Bronx, we had the conversion of the Sheridan Expressway to the Sheridan Boulevard, which really gave you direct access to the Bronx River. But now, the developer that owns the land is now putting another 990 units of housing, and it's affordable, right? But it's not affordable to the folks that live there, and that's a big problem, right? And during the process, the 20-plus year process of advocating for the changes to the Sheridan, the community did get together, and they said, this is what we'd like to see, but to the point, who do we hold accountable, right? Because the community coming together and spending all this time envisioning what this could look like, they should be the ones that are benefiting from these changes.
Thank you. So I think what I maybe have heard is that perhaps the idea of green gentrification isn't really new, and that perhaps we shouldn't be distracted by newer vocabulary words for conversations and experiences that are actually very familiar, right? I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Michelle and Mark. Michelle, I'll have you start. So as professionals in real estate and community development, what are some of the challenges that you face when trying to bring new development, especially affordable, into neighborhoods that have seen disinvestment? How does the concept of green or other gentrification intersect with these issues? And maybe if you have time, in the future, do you expect any of these approaches to shift?
Maybe now? Okay, good. Change microphones. And it's exactly what Nilka was talking about, which is as change happens, people want to see themselves in that change, and they want to see their communities in that change. And if that can't happen, then people are going to understandably be resistant to it, whether it's affordable housing or any change. I mean, when I think about, Fifth Avenue Committee and a bunch of local leaders helped lead the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice, 7 years worth of organizing around the rezoning of the Gowanus neighborhood, during the de Blasio administration. It was one of the neighborhoods that was rezoned. It was the first majority white community to be rezoned. When I moved to the area 35 years ago, Gowanus was not majority white. It was not upper income, but things have changed, and so it didn't follow the same pattern, the same narrative of some of the other rezonings that have happened, because a lot of the displacement of lower income folks of color had already happened by the time that rezoning was talked about, but that narrative was in everybody's mind, and so we had to kind of walk through and talk about what is mandatory inclusionary housing, and how would it benefit folks, and why it wasn't enough, especially with public housing developments that had hundreds of millions of dollars of deferred maintenance that needed to be addressed. And so, our coalition, which was a multiracial, multi-sector coalition, our number one demand was to make repairs in public housing before any rezoning could advance. And we secured over $200 million as part of the Gowanus neighborhood rezoning to make repairs. And it's the first design build process that's going to happen in public housing. We also secured the first community controlled oversight task force to make sure that the nearly $500 million that the city committed is being done in a timely manner. And based on the community's vision that gave input over those 7 years. So it's really, the pushback is really about, is it for me? Am I going to benefit? That's critical, that people can see themselves in it and they can see that they're going to benefit from it.
Thank you. So Mark, if you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges you face when bringing new development, especially into neighborhoods that have seen disinvestment. And in the future, do you expect any of these approaches to shift?
Well, I think to Nilka's point, like I do affordable housing or affordable housing finance, and we pat ourselves on the back when we complete the units, but and we call it affordable, and it is, but it typically isn't for the communities we're building it in. So I think educating the community about what affordable is and why those bands are where they are, and how they can advocate to get those bands to, if you're building affordable in the neighborhood, to get the bands where the neighborhood is in terms of income, makes our job harder, but it's solving problems, right? I mean, it's preventing some of that displacement, because I think we sometimes generically say affordable housing, but it's very different, and it's established at the federal level, by areas that are way too wide, right? So like, in the Bronx, the affordability limits are most of New York City, right? So 60% of median is, still over $100,000. So I think educating people on sort of like what affordability means, what it means in their neighborhood, is something I think we should all work towards, and also just like as developers and lenders, be honest about sort of when something is affordable beyond just the kind of federal or state definition of it.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just add to that, we were just doing I have some, local leaders and staff here, and we were just, we're going to do an What is Affordable Housing workshop, and we've done this What is Affordable Housing workshop with Center for Urban Pedagogy over the last 15 years to do exactly what you're talking about. But I don't, affordability is just about not paying more than 30% of your income towards rent. I mean, about half of New Yorkers pay more than 30% of their income towards rent, right? Like this is a crisis beyond, we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Like let's realize like the level of crisis we're in, and why we need to be thinking about building affordable housing and doing so at levels and at rates that actually reach the need. But only 1 in 4 people, for instance, who are eligible for Section 8, which is the federal rental subsidy program, receive it, because there's not the political will to fund a program at the level necessary to help people, right? Like we should be aghast. We can solve the homelessness problem. We can solve our affordability issues. It just takes a level of investment at scale that we have not done as a country. So I think if like our public policies and our programs actually address the need, there'd be a lot more support for what is happening.
So I think we're going to move on because I know we're short for time. But before I turn to the audience question, there's actually a question I want to ask to make sure that Francis and Nilka get a chance to respond to. And it's actually about youth. So youth are an important part of advocacy in our neighborhoods, helping to drive social change, but sometimes a voice that goes unheard. Can either one of you briefly talk about how your work incorporates youth engagement? Nilka, why don't you start?
So most of the engagement that we do is at the park. So, of course, there's going to be children at the park. And it's really important for us to have them engaged, because these projects are not going to happen next year, 5 years, right? This is their future. So we do it not just at the park, but engaging in different schools, talking to kids, high schools, getting kids involved, inviting them to press conferences, particularly when there's a success. Just yesterday, New York State DOT released the final report for the Reimagine Lacrosse Bronx feasibility study, and we were really excited to reach out to the principal of Fannie Lou Hamer High School, because one of the pictures that they used had his students behind Congressman Richie Torres and Senator Schumer. So that's one of the ways that we want to keep them engaged. Coming up with creative new ideas that, quite frankly, at my age, I wouldn't even think about, right? And really developing in them the ownership that this is their space too, right? And that their voice should be heard, and that they should be at the table. That just because they're under 18, right? That it, yes, you can't vote, but it doesn't mean that your thought and your ideas aren't valuable when it comes to shaping, the infrastructure that's around you. And we're gonna get old, right? We have to have the youth involved, not just for the fresh ideas, but somebody has to carry this torch.
Thank you. Francis, if you could explain how, you work with youth, and I'll turn it over to some of the audience questions.
Well, I think it's embedded. It's embedded in the genesis of El Puente. You saw our young people in the documentary. El Puente is a human rights organization that was really founded with a mission to inspire and nurture the next generation of leaders that would really be dedicated to the self-determination of our people and our community. And that is embedded in every single programmatic process that we have for our young people that we engage in our after-school and in-school programs. Our young people are members, and as part of the membership, they all get an orientation of the legacy that they are now part of activism in our community, with the major campaigns and frontiers that we have been able to accomplish over the decades. But for the engagement of our young people, we bring them in. We have all sorts of activities that we have to bring them in. But what they learn and what they are nurtured to understand is that the skills, the information that they are being given, and the ways in which they are being mentored is really about how and in which way they will lead what it is that they want to see happen in their community. So community mapping, community projects that community science projects, air monitoring. In our Puente Academy for Peace and Justice, it is the centerpiece of the curriculum. The community is the classroom is the community. And there's historic campaigns that the young people of El Puente have led. And I think we see ourselves at El Puente as the mentors and the facilitators of their process of leadership, their process and their plans in terms of how and in which way they want to see and affect change in the community. So young people are at every decision table, planning table, and at the forefront of all of our campaigns.
Great. Thank you. I know that youth usually don't come up in the discussion, even if they, are in the room. And so I wanted to make sure that before we even got to audience questions, we had a chance to hear. So thank you for that. Okay, so this is for everyone. So whoever feels compelled, please respond first. So we must tear down the BQE. When we do that, how can we make the economic benefits of a post-BQE corridor go to bring some sort of restoration to families who lost so much during its construction?
There's a concept of value capture, right? So that as the land values go up because the BQE comes down and, other development happens or new green space happens, that a portion of that can be set aside for reparations for families that lost their homes or lost value over time. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's what the answer is. But I think you know, all of our conversation here is really about how do we start to change a mindset. You know, if you look at this documentary, the only thing that I'm thinking about is reparations for a gross injustice, a systemic and deliberate assault, intentional assault on communities and people of color and low-income families, right? I mean, this is criminal. And so I think that we really have to start to switch our mindset in terms of any visions that we have, and we all know that we want to take down the BQE, but it has to be within the context of justice and reparations, and where and how and which way we're going to create the conditions for people who have been displaced and continue to, you know, be victim to the ravages of the, you know, the repercussions. We haven't even talked about the health inequities, right? We haven't even talked about, you know, where and how our young people and our communities are dying because of the toxic air, right? I mean, those are the kinds of things that we really have to put at the forefront on the table and say, these are the priorities, and it's around those inequities to that community and to the communities and to the people that we are now going to plan around so that it's intentional from the very beginning and it's the starting place. It's not the afterthought.
Thank you. So I'll ask another question. Why do you think zoning has become the main tool for urban planning as opposed to a true long-term intensive planning process?
Oh, boy. Like hot potato. Well, I mean, having lived in places where there's a long, deliberative process where everybody gets a say, that's not also a great thing sometimes. San Francisco, on average, it takes 7 years to get a project done, and I'm talking whether it's single-family, multifamily, affordable, or whatever else. And so I do think there's a tension between sort of having a very deliberative process, but also just having a mechanism that hopefully you get right. Maybe City of Yes, maybe our new zoning tries to get there, but I'm an advocate for, like, let's have what we value and what we want in neighborhoods, and then let it happen, rather than sort of every building has a decision. But I think sometimes in New York, I think they call it sometimes the Department of Zoning rather than the Department of Planning. It feels like that's a little bit like the easy way to do it, right? It's expedient. It's like that's what's written, rather than having the kind of larger conversation, coming to a consensus, and then having a code that works.
Yeah, and there might be a sense of accountability that's required for a more thoughtful and intensive process, and that's probably scary, right? Because that also requires you to own past decision making, you know, at least as an agency. I'm going to ask another question, if that's all right. So the largest single source of carbon in the atmosphere, which will never go away, is the American driver. Or maybe we'll just say transportation. What significant change can we make towards moving forward?
So drivers are always going to be, but I think one of the major issues, at least in the Bronx, with the Cross Bronx, is freight, right? Like, we have all these waterways, and on the south portion of the Bronx, you have the CSX line, right? So why not transport goods on the water and use these freight lines and reduce the number of trucks that are cutting through the borough? Whether that's ever going to be done is a different thing, right? But really thinking about, you know, and I'm not talking about passenger vehicles, but really, you know, the freight, you know, really thinking out of the box, and really, you know, implementation and policy change to make that happen.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, a few more questions. How would you respond to concerns that highway removal would worsen commercial traffic on local streets?
I mean, it goes back to what Milka just said. I mean, that is potentially possible, I think, especially in the short term, but I think it could be a reworking. If the emphasis were on, several of us in the room are involved in the Brooklyn Marine Terminal conversation and talking about, a blue highway network and what kind of investment that would take to take truck traffic off of our local streets. When I there was electric Amazon, tiny little trike that was delivering packages around the corner. Those things can be legislated, right? We don't have to wait for the companies to decide that that's what they want to do. We can legislate those things, and of course continue to invest in mass transit as well.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we touched on this a little bit ago, but I'll ask it in a different way. So is there a realistic world where parts of highways come down? The short answer is yes. What would, right? Right, Boston, there's the Big Dig, there's lots of examples. What do you all think specifically is needed for the BQE to be in that category?
I think it's mostly imagining that it can happen. I mean, honestly. I worked for Congresswoman Nida Velázquez in the 1990s, and I worked with Al Appleton as part of the Intermodal Surface Transportation and Efficiency Act, ICE-T for short. She was able to secure a couple $1 million to study a tunnel alternative to the BQE. That was over 30 years ago. There's been a lot of improvements in engineering since then. We should be thinking about a tunnel alternative to this thing.
Ditto. I think that's the big challenge for us all, particularly in the times that we're living in, is to really tap into our imagination. Our power and collective power is in our ability to collectively, individually and collectively, imagine, vision, and manifest, and organizing in the ways in which we organize around that. I think of the BQ Green in 2010, in Williamsburg, right? I mean, led by Councilwoman Diana Reina. Our young people were at the table with the Dylan Studios, looking at what the alternative would be, this decking that at that time was like, wow, But with that, what that decking would mean in terms of economic development, in terms of affordable housing, community centers, small businesses. It wasn't just about decking and covering, it was about what the community would look like and all of the things that we need and how that space could be utilized for that. And that came from the community, and the community rallied around that. And we had allies and partners from the North Side who supported it, It's still alive and it's still there and it's still the priority, hopefully, with what we hope with our coalition, backing us in terms of the BQE Environmental Justice Coalition, that will come to fruition. We have other challenges now because of the development, but it's still the same thing. But it was just saying we're going to claim our imagination and we're moving forward.
So I have a few other questions. So we talked a little bit about this, but I'll open this up to everyone. The rehabilitation of the BQE isn't the only major freight thoroughfare that our city is grappling with. Obviously, we've talked about the Cross Bronx, and it's also a product of the Moses era. It's undergoing a familiar engagement planning process, and similar efforts are happening across the country. What are some of the strategies that you've found to be the most successful in getting your concerns heard and meaningfully received by decision makers?
I think for us, was really forging relationships with elected officials, and really proving a case to them When we started this campaign in 2016, we were Loving the Bronx is a very grassroots organization with just a bunch of neighbors that come together. We have these out-of-the-box ideas, and people just think we're crazy. And in 2016, when we started this, there was no funding. We still have no funding. And we'd go to meetings, we'd talk to people, community board, people at different organizations, and people really thought that we were insane. This was, no one was ever going to reimagine the Cross Bronx. In 2018, there was a report that came out by a group of doctors at Columbia University looking at capping the Cross Bronx for the use of parks and open spaces. And then in 2021, Dr. Alex Levine, who's here, was part of the Bronx One policy group, and we forged this kind of trifecta between Loving the Bronx and the Bronx One policy group and Dr. Peter Munich, and we were able to go to our Congress members and be like, listen, like, here's the research, here's the medical students, here you have community, and that's really what got the ball rolling. So I think, at least for us, was really organizing, right, on the ground, but really forging these good relationships with our elected officials.
Thank you. So I think we're going to close. Yes, of course, please.
I think there's an important piece of what you're saying, though, besides the organizing, that the community had a clear vision, right? And so if you organize without the clear vision or have the clear vision without the organizing, sometimes things don't come together. So it's important you have both.
So I'd love to leave the audience with one last word from each of you. What's the one word that you would all like the audience to take with them from tonight's conversation? So, Michelle, one word.
Perseverance.
Historical memory. That's 2 words.
Pa'lante.
Took my word. But I think imagination. Imagination.
And I'll give one word. It is hope. Thank you very much for joining me.
Please join us for a beverage and a nibble, and thank you all for coming.